All right, we are going to dismiss the children to Children's Church now. So if you are one of our Children's Church volunteers this week, please stand up so that the kids can make their way over to you now. And for the rest of us, what kind of week have we had? I heard like one or two words that I didn't understand what they were, but hey, that works. Works for me. On Friday, I went and I got a haircut at a Great Clips. And the haircut that you get at Great Clips varies in quality from time to time, you know. So I went there and, I asked them to do the things with my hairline, male pattern baldness. It's coming for most of us, right? Unless you get hair plugs, but who's doing that, right? No offense to anybody with hair plugs, but you have to do some weird stuff to my hair just to get it to look semi-normal. So I asked them to do the things. They did something totally different. You can't totally tell at the end of it, right? So I was like, I guess that looks good. I don't know. I can't tell. And then as my hair dried out, I was like, oh my gosh, like my hair's like in the shape of a Z or something. And so Elise had to get our clippers and kind of even it out the next morning. And I was like, oh man. So I'm going to be having a bad hair day for the next 30 to 45 days until the next time I get a haircut. So I was feeling kind of down about that. Yesterday, we went and saw the new Mission Impossible movie as we were celebrating my birthday. And if you haven't seen it yet, Tom Cruise has the worst haircut I've ever seen in his entire life. He's got like a full-on bowl cut. He looks like a little Dutch boy as he's saving the world. And then I felt better about my own hair. But I don't think Tom Cruise cares about his hair because he has like $11 million. So he doesn't have to have good hair, right? But I hope that you guys have a better hair week. And I hope that you guys are having a great Sunday morning. It is the 4th Sunday of the month, and you know what that means. This morning, we are having this month's Ask Me Anything service. If we have any first-time visitors this morning or anybody who just came in off the street not knowing what this morning was, we are super glad that you are here and you came for a very weird service. What's happening this morning is this. We have all got questions about God, questions about the Bible, questions about Christianity that we have always wished somebody would explain to us, right? We have all got those lingering questions that we wish someone could answer for us, but that no one has ever taken the time to help walk us through, right? Well, every 4th Sunday, we devote our entire teaching time to tackling those exact questions. All month long, we have a box set up in the entryway of the church, and we have a QR code that you can scan and send your questions into, and you can ask those questions that have always confused or challenged you. And then on the 4th Sunday of the month, we count up the questions that have been sent in. We take whichever question you guys have submitted more often than any other question, and we spend the whole teaching time diving deep into answering that question. And this month, we have got a good one. The number one question that we got more often than any other question for this month is actually basically a follow-up to last month. Last month, we answered the question, how can there only be one true religion? Remember that one? And in response to the answer that we gave, we got some of the best and most important questions that we have ever received as a follow-up. We got a flood of incredible follow-up questions, but they are so in depth and heavy that it's going to take us at least a couple sessions to answer them. We're going to have to take them one at a time because over and over in response to last month's Ask Me Anything service, we got a slew of questions that all basically boil down to this. How do we know Christianity is the right religion? How do we know Christianity is actually the right religion? So from last month, we get that there can really only be one true religion. But how do we know we have the right one? We got 3 questions over and over in one form or another in response to last month's session. Number 1, how do we know that God even exists? Number 2, how do we know Jesus is actually the right God? And number 3, how do we know the Bible is actually God's word? Those are 3 incredible questions that we are going to work through one by one together over the next few Ask Me Anything services. But for this morning, we are going to start at square one. We are going to tackle the first part. How do we know that God even exists? My clicker's not working, but we're going to put this up on the screen. How do we know that God even exists? For the 14 of y'all that submitted this, thank you. I'm stoked to be able to go back over this again. But we have a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time. So I'm just going to dive straight in and start breaking it down. Sound good? Are you ready? Here we go. I'm going to spend this morning arguing that based on the evidence, I'm not even going to quote the Bible, right? Remember, these are weird services. This is really not a sermon. This is something different than a sermon. I'm not even going to quote the Bible this morning. Based on the evidence, not just the Bible, we can know beyond reasonable doubt that there is some kind of God. We're going to get into the arguments about why Jesus is that God and the Bible is his word next month. For now, we're just focusing on one thing. There is some kind of God. There is some sort of divine being that is over all things. That is not just a guess. That is not just a feeling. That is not just our opinion. A lot of times we say like, okay, well, in my opinion, this religion isn't true. And in your opinion, that religion is true. This is actually not a matter of opinion. If you genuinely look at our world, I'm going to argue that the only reasonable conclusion you can come to is that there is some sort of God. Now, there are about 1 million different reasons that philosophers and others have given behind this through the years, but I just want to lay out 3 of my favorites. These are the ones that I personally find the most compelling. Here's number 1. We know that there is a God because we know that our world was created. When I say that our world was created, I'm not expressing an opinion. We know that our world is the result of creation. How do we know that our world was created? There's a handful of reasons. Number 1, we know that our universe had a beginning. Our universe had a beginning. Take a look at the next slide after this one. once upon a time, a whole bunch of intellectuals and academics and so forth believed that the universe was eternal, that the world had just always existed. Actually, when you grew up in school, you might have heard this. It was actually already outdated by the time you were born, but you might have heard this growing up in school. For a long time, people believed the world had just always existed. Anybody remember hearing this? They called that the steady state theory. They said there is no reason to believe in a creator because our world has just always been here, so it doesn't need any explanation. But about 100 years ago, we discovered that wasn't actually true. Scientists discovered something really weird. They discovered that the galaxies that make up our world are actually moving outward. You heard that before? Every star, every planet, every single physical thing in the universe is very slowly, but measurably moving outward. Our universe is literally expanding. That was confirmed again and again and again in one test after another. They call this Hubble's law, or they call it the law of the expanding universe. Now, why am I talking about this weird science fact right now in a church service? Super simple. If the universe is expanding, if the universe is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, if the universe has always been growing outward and outward, larger and larger, what does that mean? It means if you rewind the videotape further back and further back and further back over years and years and years, what would you see? Instead of expanding, it would be what? Shrinking. Now, I'm not a scientist, but if something starts shrinking and it keeps shrinking and it keeps shrinking, what eventually happens? It disappears. If you keep rewinding all the way back as far as you can, you would see it shrink and shrink and shrink until it vanishes. It's not there anymore. You would eventually hit the what? The beginning. And before that beginning point, there would be what? Nothing. 100 years ago, they proved conclusively that our universe had a beginning, that our universe has not always been here, that once upon a time, our universe did not exist, and then it began to exist. So, number one, our universe had a beginning. And here's why that matters. It's because everything that has a beginning has a cause. That's number two. Something has to have caused the universe. The universe could not have caused itself. How do we know that the universe could not have caused itself? It's very simple. In the 1820s, scientists discovered something that today we call the second law of thermodynamics. I know I'm giving you PTSD flashbacks to like 10th grade science class, right? But if you Google it, the definition has a whole bunch of scientist type words that are kind of hard to understand, but at the very core, essentially, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot generate itself. Matter cannot kickstart itself. Physical, material, organic things, that's you and me. That is literally everything that you have ever seen in your entire life, cannot kickstart itself. The example that they usually use to explain this to normal people like us is that if you put a hot cup of coffee in a room and then you just leave it there, what happens to it? It gets cold, right? Why does it get cold? because heat is energy. So the hot cup of coffee gets cold because it loses energy, because energy naturally goes down and it does not naturally what? Go up. Energy cannot generate itself. Another example they use for people like you and me is that if you get a wind-up timer and you wind it up to 60 minutes, what happens? It gradually goes down. But the wind-up timer can't wind itself back up. Why not? Because that is a form of energy. And energy cannot what? Cannot kickstart itself. The only way for that cup of coffee to get hot again is if someone else comes in from the outside and heats it back up. The only way for that clock to wind back up again is someone else comes in from the outside and what? Winds it back up. The universe is exactly the same. I love the way that the Pennsylvania State University scientist John Cimbala puts it. He says, now consider the entire universe as one giant closed system. Since energy is constantly changing from available to unavailable energy, someone had to what? Give it available energy in the beginning. The universe is a giant mass of physical, material, organic energy that cannot have kickstarted itself. And that means, number 3, that something must have kickstarted the universe from the outside. The fact that the universe has a beginning and it cannot have begun itself means that something or what? Someone must have kickstarted it from the outside. To put that in science-y terms, our universe needs an external cause. What kind of external cause? We actually have a very good idea of what kind it would have to be. The universe was kickstarted with such precision that it must have been the work of an intelligent creator. That is number 4. The universe was kickstarted with such precision that it must have been the work of an intelligent creator. About 70 years ago, a group of scientists discovered residual traces from the Big Bang. At its core, the Big Bang was a giant cosmic explosion. If you blow something up on your driveway, what happens? It leaves ash and a bunch of residue, right? So, if the greatest conceivable explosion happens in the entire universe, what's it going to do? It's going to leave some residual traces, right? They spent the next 30 years studying those traces, and what they found was that the Big Bang should not have worked. What they found was that if anything at all had gone any differently when the Big Bang originally took place, the development of life would never have been possible. I'm going to say that again real quick. If anything at all had gone any differently when the Big Bang originally took place, the development of life would never have been possible. I love the way that Frank Turek and Norman Geisler put it. They said the ripples showed that the explosion and expansion of the universe was precisely tweaked to cause just enough matter to congregate to allow galaxy formation. That's important. But not enough to cause the universe to collapse back in on itself. Any slight variation one way or the other, and none of us would be here to tell about it. The Big Bang was so precisely tuned that only an intelligent and careful creator could have done it. I love the way that Robert Jastrow, he was one of the most prestigious astronomers of the 20th century, and until the day he died, he was an agnostic. He never followed any one religion, but famously, he wrote this. He said, astronomers now find we have painted ourselves into a corner because we've proven by our own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation, that there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work. This is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. This is reason number one why we should believe in some sort of God. It's because we know beyond reasonable doubt that our universe has a creator. But actually, equally important is number two. And that is that we know beyond reasonable doubt that our universe has a designer. Our universe wasn't just created. Our universe was very carefully designed. Here's how I'm going to put this. This is a basic reality that pretty much everybody accepts if they think about it for more than 2 seconds. Complex, intricate, and orderly things require a designer. Know what I'm talking about? Complex, intricate, and orderly things require a designer. I'm going to give you a couple of examples to explain what I mean when I say that. Imagine you were walking through a field and you found like a watch, like the one that I'm wearing. This is a really cheap smartwatch. This is the $30 smartwatch. So I don't know how long it's going to last, right? But this is the low-end smartwatch. Imagine you found a smartwatch in the middle of a field. What would the first thing that popped into your head be? You would never say, wow, this must have randomly grown out of the ground. Your first thought would not be, wow, I can't believe that the vegetation here is capable of growing fully functional smartwatches out of the ground. There you go. Now you'd say somebody must have made this, and somebody must have bought this, and somebody must have accidentally dropped this here, because a smartwatch, by its very nature, is a complex, and intricate, and orderly piece of machinery. Here's another one. Imagine you came home one day and you found a fully functional car engine in your front yard. What would the first thing you thought be? It would probably not be, there were some pretty heavy rains and winds while I was at work. Maybe you just blew all the parts together and they kind of assembled themselves as a result of the wind. That would not make any sense, would it? Why not? Because complex, intricate, and orderly things don't just come about randomly. You would say somebody must have designed this car engine. Somebody must have bought a car with this engine, and then somebody must have left it in my front yard. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it's the neighborhood teenagers because I kept calling the cops on them. Here's why this matters. The simplest life forms on Earth are infinitely more complex than the most sophisticated human inventions in all history. Case in point, the human ear requires thousands of tiny bones to work together in perfect harmony to make hearing possible. Your ability to hear right now is only actually possible because of thousands of tiny little mechanisms that fit perfectly together to transmit sound into your brain. Here's another one. Gravity has to be perfectly fine-tuned, or else life itself would cease to be possible. I love the way that Stephen Hawking puts this. He says, if the rate of the universe's expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million. I don't even know how to conceptualize that number. The universe would have recollapsed into a hot fireball. The origins of the universe would never have been possible if there were anything even slightly different about the universal gravitational pull. Here's another case in point. The Earth's distance from the sun had to be perfectly fine-tuned, or else the development of life would never have been possible. If the Earth had been any closer to the sun, the heat would have sterilized everything, and as a result, what would have happened? Nothing could have formed or developed, right? If the Earth had been any further from the sun, then all of the billions of chemical reactions that rely on the sun's heat and light and so forth would have been so slow that they could never actually have formed into life-developing conditions in the first place. Here's another case in point. The energy levels within our atoms had to be perfectly fine-tuned for the development of life to be possible. I know we're getting real abstract here, but try to bear with me. We are carbon-based life forms, and carbon-based life forms like us can only exist because the necessary helium atoms, like balloons, collided under the exact right conditions, at the exact right time, at the exact right speed, under the exact right circumstances, and they weren't off by even a fraction of 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 a hair. Everything we see around us is possible only because the energy levels of all the different forms of atoms were perfectly fine-tuned to make the development of life possible. And listen, those are just a few examples, but there are literally hundreds of others. And the list grows even more every single year. There are innumerable factors that had to be perfectly fine-tuned to make any form of life at all possible in the universe. And what all of this means is that it is really not reasonable to look at our world and think that it is somehow the result of random chance. I love the way that the renowned physicist P.C.W. Davies puts it. Why don't these guys ever have normal names? Why are they always hard to say? He said the odds against the initial conditions of the universe being suitable for later star formation, without which planets could not exist, is 1 followed by 1,000 billion zeros at least. Again, I don't even know what that number would look like. But I think the best way to illustrate this will be to talk about poker. My poker playing friends tell me that a royal flush is an unbelievably lucky hand to get. Is that true? I don't know. I have a hard time holding on to my money already. They say if you were playing a game of poker and you get a royal flush, everybody's jaw is going to be on the floor, right? Now, they also tell me that if you're playing a game of poker and you get 2 royal flushes in a row, you're about to have a bad time, because that's extremely suspicious, because it is profoundly unlikely that you are going to get 2 royal flushes in a row. In numerical terms, you have a 1 in 422 billion chance of getting a royal flush twice in a row. They tell me that if you were to get 5 straight royal flushes, then your friends would no longer be your friends. They would hold you down, start breaking your legs, right? Start hitting your knuckles with a hammer, because there is absolutely no possible way that you aren't jerry-rigging this game to keep on getting royal flushes, because it is that unlikely. Know what I'm talking about? Here's the thing. Multiply that by 100. There is a greater mathematical likelihood that you will get 500 royal flushes in a row in a game of poker than there is that every single one of the literally hundreds of necessary factors in the universe perfectly lined up, were perfectly fine-tuned to make the origin of life possible. That demands an explanation that goes way beyond chance or randomness, doesn't it? I love the way that Freeman Dyson, the renowned physicist, put it. He said, the more I examine the details or the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe must, in some sense, have known that we were coming. The NASA astrophysicist John O'Keefe famously wrote, if the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. So it is my view that these circumstances indicate that the universe was created for us to live in. I love the way that Fred Hoyle, the legendary British astrophysicist, put it. He said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. That is reason number 2 why we should believe in some sort of God. We believe because we know beyond reasonable doubt that our complex, intricate, and orderly universe must have had a designer. And that brings us to number 3. And that is that we believe there is a God because we know beyond reasonable doubt that our universe must have had something I'm going to call a moral lawgiver. I know that's kind of abstract, but I'm going to say it again. We know beyond reasonable doubt that our universe must have had a moral lawgiver. What on earth am I talking about? Here's what I'm talking about. I want to point out something really obvious really quick. We have a built-in sense of right and wrong. Know what I'm talking about? We have a built-in sense of right and wrong. We have a built-in sense of good and bad. We have an innate sense of just and unjust, right? Honorable and dishonorable, admirable and shameful, acceptable and unacceptable, that we literally do not have the power to think past. There may be surface level differences between cultures and time periods, but the big picture sense, humanity comes straight out of the oven with an absolutely unshakable sense of moral law. From the biggest things in the world, like 9/11, to the smallest things in the world, like your coworker who keeps stealing your paper clips and microwaving fish in the office kitchen. I'm going to kill that guy. Everyone has an internal sense of good versus bad, right? We intuitively recognize good behavior and we intuitively recognize bad behavior. I'm going to prove it to you real quick. There's some complex situations that force us to think with a little more sophistication, but for 99% of things, we instinctively know basic right and wrong. Case in point, when you see somebody helping an old lady across the street, you say, hey, that's good, right? When you see somebody running over an old lady with their car, you say, hey, that's bad. When you see a kid in your daughter's class share his pencil with her because she needs one, you say, hey, call the reverend. We're going to have a wedding. When you see a dude in your daughter's class pour scalding hot soup all over her, you say, hey, call the or call the reverend. There's about to be a funeral, right? Even if our consciences don't work perfectly because of the fall, because of our sinful nature, we still have a conscience, don't we? And that matters deeply because horrific evils stir up our conscience in a really specific way. Horrific evils force our conscience to recognize the reality of moral law. Events like 9/11 force us to look evil in the face and say that is evil, right? The Holocaust forces us to look evil in the face and call it what it is. When things like this happen, they force us to say, this is not how the world is supposed to be. Our internal moral compass is written into us in permanent ink. And that forces us to ask a really important question. Where does right and wrong come from? Where does good and bad come from? Why is this good and why is that bad? Where do the rules come from? This seems like it should be simple, doesn't it? But it is not simple at all. I'll prove it to you. There are basically three explanations that people have given throughout history to explain where right and wrong come from. Number one is the common sense view. This is the one you hear probably from most people. They say right and wrong is obvious. They say everybody knows right from wrong. They say these things are right because they just obviously are. They say these things are wrong because, well, obviously that's wrong. They say it's just common sense. Didn't your mama teach you right from wrong? Wait a minute. Wait a minute. If it's common sense, why'd your mama have to teach you right and wrong? Right? They say it's just common sense. Ever heard that one before? Maybe you've said that one before. Maybe you said it like this morning in an argument with somebody. If so, I'm sorry. It is not just common sense. The common sense view of right and wrong falls apart when you ask really simple questions like, why? I was a kid who spent most of my time in the principal's office growing up. I was not a well-behaved child. I really threw my teachers for a loop. I really threw my Sunday school teachers through a loop. All right, I was like 8. One of my Sunday school teachers called me a pervert. I was 8. But here we are. I ruffled a lot of teachers' feathers as a kid. One of the reasons was I was not someone who was just going to go with the flow. I was not just going to put my head down and follow the crowd. I was not just going to do what people said. I always wanted to know why. Why are we doing this? Why do we need to do that? Why are we doing this assignment? 3 months from now, we're going to have a kid. We'll see how this goes. The common sense view of right and wrong falls apart when you ask really simple questions like, why? Who says? When someone says this is wrong, says who? That is wrong. How do you know? This is good and you should do it. Based on what? Everybody knows that this is right and that is wrong. Who gets to define right? Who gets to define wrong? Why should you believe them? It's common sense that you shouldn't do this. Who gets to choose what counts as common sense? Who got elected common sense authority? Here's the reality. If you have any beliefs at all about what is good and what is bad, you have to be able to answer the question, why? Every reason you can give for why something is right or wrong eventually runs out of justification unless you can anchor it to some kind of absolute authority. And the common sense view cannot do that. That's number one. Here's number two. The second most common answer that people give is that right and wrong is ultimately about public opinion. Know what I'm talking about? Say right and wrong comes from the majority. This is right because most people say it's right. That is wrong because most people say that it's wrong. There's a major problem with that. Public opinion changes. Ever notice that? Public opinion is not the same today as it was 100 years ago. Public opinion today is not the same as it was 15 years ago. And beyond that, public opinion is often wildly, horrifyingly wrong. Case in point, in 1823, most Americans thought slavery was not only acceptable, but actually good. That was public opinion in 1823. In the 1930s and 40s, the majority of Germans believed that persecuting the Jews was good. They didn't vote for Hitler despite the fact that he was going to persecute the Jews. They voted for Hitler because they wanted him to persecute the Jews. That was democracy working exactly the way it's designed to work. That was the will of the people. That was public opinion. Were they right or wrong? They were dead wrong. That means that right and wrong cannot be based on public opinion alone. It cannot just come from the majority. It needs something deeper, something stronger, something sturdier. In reality, there is only actually one explanation for morality that doesn't completely fall apart when you scrutinize it. That is what philosophers call the moral law view. The moral law view says that right and wrong is authoritative no matter what. That it's not dependent on public opinion, that it's not dependent on the majority view or the will of the people. The moral law view says that right and wrong exist, even if everybody disagrees with it. That this thing is right, regardless of what anybody thinks, that those things are wrong, regardless of what everybody thinks. And it says that the reason is because right and wrong comes from a higher law. That right and wrong comes from an eternal law. That they come from an unchanging moral law. And it says that that unchanging moral law comes from an absolute authority that it calls the moral law giver. I think the best explanation of the moral law view comes from Martin Luther King Jr. This is from his letter from a Birmingham jail. He says, a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of line with the moral law. An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Now, Before he was a civil rights activist, he was a theologian from an Ivy League school. So some of that language is just a little bit complex, but listen to the point that he's making. He wrote this paragraph in response to a whole bunch of people who had written to him saying he should quit crusading for civil rights. They said, right now, you don't have public opinion on your side. He said, I don't care if I have public opinion on my side. He said, the problem with segregation is that it's an infraction against the moral law that God wrote into the universe. He says, God didn't create us to live this way. Therefore, we bloody well better not live this way. That is the moral law. You, and listen, that is the only explanation for morality, for right and wrong, that doesn't completely fall apart when you start to ask questions about it. And so basically, we come to a point where we hit a brick wall. Only one of two things can be true. Either right and wrong come from a moral lawgiver who's an absolute authority over all things, or right and wrong don't exist. The only two options that we actually have are to say right and wrong comes from some sort of God, or that right and wrong is a figment of our imagination. That's the brick wall. We're not actually capable of not believing in right versus wrong, are we? Try. You can't do it. You might convince yourself that right and wrong doesn't apply to you, but it absolutely applies to other people, right? Had a conversation with a guy one time and he said, I don't know why Christians make such a big deal about sex, right? Like it's just a physical act. There's no right and wrong to it. I can sleep with whoever I want. I was like, okay, cool. You can sleep with whoever you want. Imagine you came home from a business trip one day and your girlfriend had slept with the entire Seattle Seahawks team. How would you feel then? You'd say, well, shut up. And then the conversation was over. You can convince yourself that right and wrong doesn't exist for you. You cannot convince yourself it doesn't exist for others. We are not capable of not believing in right versus wrong. You believe in a moral law, even if you think you don't. And if there's a moral law, there must be a moral law giver. I want to bring this home as clearly as I can. If you believe that domestic violence is wrong, you believe in God. You think you don't, but you do. If you believe that pedophilia is wrong, if you have some problems with Jeffrey Epstein's island, you believe in God, even if you think you don't. If you believe that Casey Anthony murdering her child in 2008 was wrong, you believe in God, whether you realize it or not. If you believe the concentration camps that the Chinese government is currently holding the Muslim population of China in are wrong, did you know that was happening? Now you do. If you believe that's wrong, you believe in God, whether you realize it or not. If you believe in any kind of right versus wrong, you cannot be an atheist, even if you think you are. Because your belief in right and wrong requires that there must be a creator and designer and moral law giver. That is reason number 3 for why we should believe in God. And what all of this means is that the question we have to ask is actually not, is there a God? Because the answer, I think, is pretty obviously yes. The question we need to be asking is, which God is actually real? But that is a question that we're going to have to pick up at next month's Ask Me Anything service. We're going to tackle the question, how do we know that Jesus is actually the right God. We'll pick it up there next month, but between now and then, don't stop asking questions. Keep asking hard questions. Keep holding up your difficulties and your confusions and your doubts and your uncertainties to the light of God's word so that we can work through them together. So we've put up a QR code on the screen that you can scan and send in even more of your most difficult questions about God and the Bible and Christianity. And I can't wait to trek through them together with you next month. And so now, if you would stand as we respond in worship through song.